What's up, everybody, and welcome back to a special edition of the Occupy Fantasy Podcast. It's mid-March, which means it's time to talk about March Madness and let you in on some secrets on how to win your bracket pools, how to make the best bets, strategy, tips, everything you need to have a profitable March. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy. I'm joined by Moose, other co-founder of Occupy Fantasy, and I'm joined by the third co-founder of Occupy Fantasy, Walid. Gentlemen, what's up? Moose, I'll go to you. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. March is always a fun time. You get so many games on, especially for college basketball. We've talked about this before, Brian, with Super Bowl, where so much money comes in. It's not necessarily always sharp money that shapes these lines. Sometimes it's public money as well. So always a different breed.
Absolutely. And Walid making his annual appearance on the podcast. Lee, what's up, brother?
Not too much. You could always drag me back here for some March Madness. Yeah, best time of the year. We, in 2000, missed the tournament due to COVID. Last year, we got back in the swing of things, but, there weren't any crowds. Something felt a little missing, and it does feel like now, in 2022, things are, quote-unquote, back to normal in the college hoops world.
Yes, absolutely. And we are happy to have it back. Just a little brief agenda for what you can expect from this podcast. We're going to talk about the state of the tournament for 2022, how it looks from a high level, making bets, what to look for, our favorite Final Four and championship picks. And we're big on numbers, but we're going to talk about some spots where analytics and numbers may be missing the full picture, the best leverage plays for your brackets, and then we'll close it out with strategies based on the type of bracket pool that you are in. Make sure you're subscribed, whether you're watching the video on YouTube or in a podcast app. Give us a thumbs up if you like. If you have any questions, you can always join our Discord server, occupyfantasy.com/Discord. And we are running a free occupyfantasy.com bracket contest for our Discord members. Check out the college basketball channel in the Discord server to get more information. It is free to enter, but we do have a prize package for the one who finishes on top. I'm going to kick it to you, Moose, and you can get us started with the pod.
So thanks for kicking it off to me. And again, reminder to definitely check out the Occupy Fantasy bracket in the Discord channel. Wally, first question I'm going to ask for you is, the state of the tournament. Do you think it's wide open? Do you think it's very top heavy? What's your thought on that?
It's funny. I think every year, the rhetoric is like, this is going to be the most unpredictable tournament, right? And you kind of hear it pretty consistently. I definitely sense, in a way, like different tiers of teams. I think perhaps like the national championship contenders, 5, 6, maybe 7 teams, which is usually right around where it's at. I think maybe where the tournament is a little more volatile is, the potential, Final Four teams, potential like even Elite Eight teams. And I just think that between, it could go down to like the 4 line down to, even some double digit seeds where the talent gap isn't that crazy right now. Selection committee, they rolled out the bracket on Sunday. Definitely thought there were some misses as far as like properly seeding teams. But we have so much information at our disposal, betting odds, Ken Palm analytic resources. Even if you hadn't paid a lick of attention to college hoops this year, you can get up to speed pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I'm looking at here. This is the odds from this morning over at Circa out in Las Vegas. There's only 2 teams under 6-1 with Gonzaga and Arizona, but there's I think 9 or 10 teams under 20-1. So I do think it is kind of concentrated, but at the same time is kind of wide open. So I think it should be pretty interesting. And again, we'll get to this later, but depending on your bracket, how top heavy it is, or how normal the scoring system is, don't necessarily need to get that correct champion. But Walid, another question for you, because Brian, you admittedly said you don't really follow any college hoops. What are some potential first round or second round upsets that you're looking at, Walid?
I'll be careful to call them upsets because the betting odds, right? Like the markets are really sharp, and I'm I'm only 30 years old, right? I couldn't imagine like 20 years ago what these betting markets looked come March Madness. There's probably a lot more to take advantage of, but I mean, you look across the board. I mean, start for instance, like in the West regional with Arkansas and Vermont. Vermont, one of the most potent offenses um, in Division One, and they're only 5 point underdogs, right? So that's going to be, I think, a relatively popular one as a 13 seed. They're and some of these 13 seeds are really strong across the board. You go over to the other side. Providence is only a 2 point favorite to the Bunnies, the Jackrabbits from South Dakota State. And once again, what best 3 point shooting team in the nation? They can shoot lights out. Providence is those that followed college hoops all year. One of the luckiest teams, if not the luckiest team in the nation. They just they probably won like 14 games. They're probably like 14-2 or something of that sort with games that come down to like 5 points or less. So, but those aren't really crazy upsets, right? Like 2 points when you're
Yeah.
looking at the betting markets. That's not screaming much. So I don't know. And I'll say this just to kind of preface it. Like, I usually don't overthink the first round when I'm selecting my brackets. I don't want to get too cute. I don't care. I don't care to get, majority, like 30 out of 32 first round games. I'm thinking ahead. I'm thinking earliest Sweet 16, Elite Eight. If I'm picking an upset, like what the risk is taking that top team out. What's the reward if I'm not going to pick them beyond, the round of 32? So maybe not my specific wheelhouse. Like usually, and I've had success in bracket pools before. First round, it's not like I'm at top of the leaderboard picking these upsets.
Definitely. And Brian, I'll kind of kick this one back to you. We're talking about upsets and potentially game theory. There's a bunch of websites out there that show public pick percentages on their brackets. ESPN is one that comes to mind. If you're looking, like, is there some sort of limit that you put in? I'm not going to select anything that has under 30% public percent because that's too much of an upset. Is there anything that you're doing like that on your brackets?
Yeah, it really comes down to, like Walid said, what your scoring system's like in your bracket. I know there are some brackets out there, and I think it's a really interesting concept where you get upset points. And in those
Yeah.
brackets, that's where you start to focus on where there may be some leverage in what the betting markets are saying or whichever predictor sources that you trust versus what this public ownership is saying. And as you referenced, most the ESPN data is the essential. If you follow us for DFS, you know us for projected ownership. ESPN's public bracket data is basically the best type of projected ownership you could possibly get in any game contest because what ESPN does is they have data on every single bracket that is submitted to their site and they publish the picks of this conglomerate by the public for every single round of the tournament. So you're able to go in and see down as specific as how many brackets pick North Carolina to make the Sweet 16, how many brackets pick St. Mary's to reach the Elite Eight. And by seeing the individual steps, we're able to kind of compare it to what the lines are or what our sources are telling us as to
Yeah.
what the leverage could possibly be.
And for DFS players, that's pretty. It's like getting ownership projections, right? Except these are like there's a lot of data. Like there's millions of entries going into it. Of course, once again, it varies in the pool you're in. ESPN, like these could be anyone. Like people at family work pools. If you're doing like DraftKings, like millionaire bracket, you're gonna get a sharper crowd there. If you're doing it with a bunch of I don't know Duke alum, right? You're going to have some tilting here or there, but no, it's such a vital piece of information to know. Okay, what's the general consensus thinking, and how does it line up with what are the actual odds of these events occurring? And that just gives you a little blueprint. And sometimes it's easy to say, oh well, consensus is thinking this. I'm going to fade the public because the odds are 10% less, but that doesn't always mean it's the right play too, right? Like you don't want to just be a robot when filling out your bracket.
Definitely. And speaking of brackets, there's also some betting involved as well. Brian, you're not in a legal state. Walid, I know you've been getting your exercise in, walking down in DC. You can only do it in certain geolocations. Are there any future
Yeah.
bets that you've made or any particular singles bets you've made so far?
Not yet. Honestly, I've like my process once the bracket is out, I'm really like zeroed in on that. I'm sure, maybe once the games actually start and everything's submitted, I'll look into it. But honestly, get my advice from you as far as like betting on futures. It's better to kind of roll the money line, right? Versus take the odds that um you're given for single game.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the futures holds are like anywhere from like 15 to 30%, depending on which book you're at, which is a pretty large hold, but pretty standard for futures. Any type of future bet I've made, I've always tried to do a rolling money line. It can be a little tricky if you're trying to bet a number one seed that has, you know,
Minus 1,500.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it might make sense to not necessarily do that, or if you want to, maybe buy points the other way. So instead of them betting them minus 20, might be able to, bet them minus 10 or something like that to get some better odds that way. A couple of bets that I've made so far, I've bet some big favorites early, just in the sense that I think that line's a lot of public likes to bet favorites, large favorites. So I bet Duke at minus 17. That was one of my big bets. That I think it's 18 now. So
Yeah, it's
I still think
18 points now.
I still think that might move a little bit more. I think for betting large underdogs, I think you want to wait as long as possible. What do you think? You think that makes sense, Wally?
Yeah, and I mean nowadays, and this isn't like, I'm not giving out any advice, but I know some people too that they're going to be live betting and maybe
Yeah.
waiting for the right time for that, money line or the spread to kind of work its way out. So there's, we've opened up Pandora's box as far as betting goes, and it's not like, I dabble in it. It's really fun. But at the same time, like the last few days for me, I've just been kind of looking at it from a like, bracket strategy standpoint versus singular games. And something I did want to allude to is I know we had kind of discussed, like potential favorite upsets or like what do we like in the first round. And I said, hey, I like to pump the brakes and not kind of force the hand. A good example that kind of came to mind is if like we look at like the Duke region, right? The Duke pod with Cal State Fullerton, Michigan State, Davidson. Let's say I'm making 20 brackets, right? There's no doubt if like whoever, let's say Michigan State beats Duke, or Davidson, I should say Michigan State beats Davidson and they end up playing in the round of 32. There's no doubt that, there's probably like a 20% chance that Michigan State can win that game, right? However, I'm not going to, I just don't look at Michigan State as a legitimate Final Four contender. This could come back and bite me. So I'm not even going to sweat that, right? I'm not even going to complicate it. So in my brackets, I'm just going to zoom Duke straight to the Sweet 16. And look, if someone else nails that pick, good for them. Let's see how the rest of their bracket looks.
Exactly, because if you think like if you look at just Michigan State in general, like you said, maybe a 20% chance. But even if that hits, again, that's not a huge portion of the total points that are going to come into play at the end of winning your bracket. So yeah, you may get that right, but what are you really gaining from it? Because is Michigan State going to advance to the Elite Eight or the Final Four, which is where most of the points are made in most brackets? The first two rounds, like you said, Lead, it's just there's no reason to get too tricky, Moose, unless we said like it's an upset bracket. Then you can start taking some chances, but even then, you're really
Yeah.
picking your spots.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
format, right? Once again, I know we kind of alluded to, but I think the two biggest things are the size of your pool and the payouts, right? Like, is it a 100-person pool where top 10 get, prizes? Is it a 15, 20-person pool? Or is it like one of these like $9,000, $10,000 pools like DraftKings where, first place gets $1 million and everyone else gets the middle finger and says, good luck next year. And then the format. There's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 format. Then there's the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 format. The more you get to the kind of exponential format, you may as well start building your bracket from the inside out, right? You may as well start with your champion, who's in that game, Final Four, and work backwards, because that stuff at the end of the day is going to be what makes the difference. Whereas if you're in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-point league, well, then there may be some weight in saying, you know what? Let's say for some reason you're like you like Texas Tech a lot. You're taking Texas Tech to the Final Four. You're like, I can take a chance at that 7 or 10 seed beating Duke, because at the end of the day, I'm still going to have Texas Tech get past them anyway. So what in theory I would lose is just 2 points to my opponents there.
I mean, because I'm just looking here at you mentioned the DraftKings pool. The champion gets 320 points, which is just an absolute god amount. Basically, that's half of the first round correct picks. So, you can take some chances in those rounds. It's not necessarily going to matter, but you basically, in those pools, you have to get the champion, Final Four, and not really else matters.
Yeah.
It literally doesn't matter what your first round picks are, as long as you get like 20% right. If you get the Final Four and champion correct in a pool with those types of rules, you're gonna win. That's all that matters.
Mm-hmm. And then also in like every year is different. And no, I hate that cliche, but it's just so true. So like last year, for instance, we had really the two favorites in the national championship game, Gonzaga and Baylor, who were, I'd say, head and shoulders above the other 1 seeds even. You had Houston, who's a 2 seed, more of a darling, but they also rated really well in KenPom. And then you had UCLA, who made it from the playing game, right? So even in like $1 million bracket there, nobody got all 4 Final Four teams, right? That's because there was an 11 seed from a play-in game that got all the way there. That doesn't happen all the time. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that, a 5 seed like St. Mary's or UConn or a 4 seed can't make the Final Four, right? But just keep that in mind. If you end up getting a chalky Final Four where it's Kentucky, Kansas, Arizona, Gonzaga, right, Duke, a large pool, so many people are going to have those Final Fours that maybe there's where you're like, okay, how can I differentiate those? Where if this does happen, maybe that's where you take a stab at one of these double-digit seeds to go to a Sweet 16.
Yeah, you pretty much hit that on the head there. Really quick, back to bets. I do want to get your standpoint on this one, Brian. Because you did used to bet sometime back in the day. We do out to Vegas as well. Do you think any parlays make sense here, or in the sense of, I know there's some sites that used to be where you could do rolling parlays, or you could have one, leave one open. I don't know if you want to do that.
That sounds fun. I wish that existed.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, those are fun. But I was gonna say, or do you just take the stand that it's March Madness, it's fun, let's throw a couple parlays down?
I mean, we're always of the opinion if you can have some fun as long as it's within your bankroll limits, that's the way to go. We see single game parlays on FanDuel and DraftKings blowing up because of how fun they are. Are they terrible odds? Yes. Are they probably the most fun you could have? Also, yes, right? So it just depends on what you're trying to do with betting. So, yeah, if you want to throw some parlays together, go for it. If you want to be smart about it, I think parlaying some of the big money line favorites is probably a pretty safe bet in most cases, the 1 seeds, the 2 seeds. And if you want to just increase your odds a little bit, throwing those money lines in with some of the other picks that you like, that's always the way to go. And we see the public do that a lot, but I think it can be sharp in some spots.
And Lee, you've actually been doing this sometimes too with college basketball, where if you have 4 or 5 bets and you're saying you're doing 1 unit on each of them, you might throw a couple dollars, literally a couple dollars on the parlay. That if you crush, you're crushing even more, because a couple dollars isn't necessarily a big percentage of what you're overall betting.
Right, exactly. And as long as you don't whiff, like it'll kind of hopefully you're not losing much, or it'll cover your whatever potential losses. But no, I like I said, I've been almost too focused on the bigger picture that I'm sure I'll sit down and like granularly start looking at like, oh, can this team cover? And I'll probably have something, come Thursday that I'm tossing together.
Definitely. So let's go ahead. Let's jump to the next section of this. Let's talk about some of our favorite Final Four and championship picks. Brian, I'll start off with you. Is there any team that you like that kind of stands out that you think can make it all the way to the Final Four, even win the thing?
Yes, I think it's really interesting. And one of the biggest questions you'll have to answer when making brackets this year or making bets is, what do you do with Gonzaga? Because in the ESPN brackets, as of Tuesday afternoon, roughly 30% of entries are picking Gonzaga to win it all, which is pretty crazy. But if you look at the
gone down a little. It is now, for what it's worth, 27.4%. So I'm actually monitoring that number. I'd be curious to see where we're at come Thursday.
Yeah, because if you look at the analytics, right? If you look at whatever source you trust, KenPom, any other predictive analytics out there, I mean, that's pretty close to what Gonzaga's actual odds are of winning the tournament. So it's not a bad play. And if you're in a smaller pool, like, you definitely want to play those types of plays. Where it gets interesting is because once you get from Gonzaga, you get down to all these teams in the 5 to 15% range, and really 5 to 10% range. And the ones that stick out to me are uh, Auburn. I really like, and I think there's some positive leverage there to win it all. We'll get to why the analytics lie a little bit because Houston stands out from a numbers standpoint, but they may not be the pick you want to pick to win it all for a couple of reasons that Walid will hit on here in a bit. But I think there are some 2 and 3 seeds that could make it there. And honestly, just looking, Kentucky, I think is another 2 seed that really has a big chance there. And I'm just looking at it from the perspective of who's going to win it all. Believe there are other
Yeah.
teams that I think making the finals and making the Final Four that really offer a lot of leverage that you're not really risking too much to get them there.
Yeah, no, you mentioned Auburn. They've struggled recently. Um, the guard play has been holding the team back. However, I mean, they have kind of the quote unquote DNA you may look for in a potential team that can make a run. And quite honestly, they're in a favorable region, I think. In fact, I'd argue, just taking a step back, I think Gonzaga is in the toughest region, right? Like let's look at it for what it is. Duke, they should have been a 3 seed, but they were a 2 seed. We know the talent on that team, that upside. Then you have Texas Tech, Arkansas, UConn, even Alabama. An Alabama team who's the most inconsistent team in the nation. They beat Gonzaga earlier in the year as well, right? And then when I look at the Kansas Auburn region, like you have Wisconsin, who's only they're going to be what's the line on them versus Colgate right now?
Let me
That's a
look
good
here.
question.
7 points, like single digit for a 3-4
7 points,
team.
yeah.
And
Right?
would they even be
Um,
favored over LSU in the second round if they meet up?
That, well, that it would be, but not by much, right? If anything, I mean, it's a team that relies solely on all American, all world Johnny Davis, but there's not much else there. They do protect the ball and they don't turn it over, but I mean, their shooting percentage is pretty bad. For a 3 seed, right? Did they just feel a little overseeded?
Yeah.
The same way Providence kind of feels. Maybe not, and I'm not arguing about the resume because at the end of the day, you're seeded what you're seeded. Like these teams won a lot of close games. They earned it. But when you look at even like Wisconsin's KenPom rating, they're below Michigan. So really contextualize that. They're below Ohio State. They're below UNC, Memphis, teams that are like 7 to 9, 11 seeds even. So Kansas is in Auburn, right? Now you got to pick one out of that region, but I think the fact that there isn't as much heat for them, both Providence and Wisconsin, I think the weakest 3 and 4 seeds are in their region. Arizona, I just think that they like it's 1A, 1B for me as far as when I look at teams, talent, and how like coaching and execution. Arizona is right there with Gonzaga, right? They play in some ways. They both play up tempo, and I mean, you're looking at a team who's coach like Tommy Lloyd. He was an assistant under Mark Few for all these years, so like they've taken a lot of what Gonzaga does well. So Arizona, relative to Gonzaga, who's being picked almost twice as much, is interesting. But yeah, I like Kentucky. I think they have the tools. It's a team that's gotten better, and Ty Washington was kind of dealing with an ankle injury. If he looks good to go, if that's the case, they're right there. But I'm not picking any teams outside the 1 and 2 line as my champion for what it's worth.
Well, let me ask you this really quickly about Baylor, because that is I mean, again, and I say this as someone who hasn't followed college basketball much, and I'm mostly following the strategy and the numbers here. If you look at Baylor to make the final and to win the championship, their numbers and their public pick percentage lines up pretty evenly or pretty close, right, to where they're a decent pick. However, if you look at them to make the Final Four, to make the Sweet 16, to make the Elite Eight, there's a pretty big discrepancy in how often the public is picking them versus what the numbers say. And the numbers are much lower on Baylor getting to those individual points than the public are. But if Baylor does make it there, the numbers like them to actually have a chance at competing for the title. So I'm wondering, Lead or Moose, what you guys make of that discrepancy.
I think it comes back to two guys, LJ Cryer, who's, I mean, hopefully he's back. That's their leading scorer, right? I'm not going to say he's their best player, but clearly a vital piece. And we know Jonathan Chamwa Chachwe, who's their rim protector, right? You're talking, such a vital piece of their defense. He's out for the season. So the rotation is smaller. They're the two line. I should say the competition in their region is pretty tough. Scott Drew is one of the best coaches in D1, and it's interesting because in theory, if they somehow get to the Final Four, and let's say LJ Cryer, is able to play down those games, you just never know. Their analytics are excellent. They're fifth in KenPom. Their resume, like they've beaten good teams. Like they totally strapped Villanova, held them to 36 points. That was at home earlier in the year.
Villanova out of the tournament. If we meet the 40-point criteria, they shouldn't be in the tournament.
Yeah, Brian said if you score under 40 at any point, you shouldn't be allowed in the tournament.
I mean, who can argue with that though? For real.
It's fair, but I mean, we've seen them lose games to teams like Oklahoma, who not a bad team, right? Like good enough to be in the tournament. They just lost too many games, but that was on a neutral court. But they've also beaten Kansas without Cryer and Chamwe Chachra. So I just don't know. It's certainly I think there is some long-term leverage if you get there. Cryer, I don't know. It's just a team that for a 1 seed, I can understand why folks are looking at like UNC as a potential upset. Now, perfect example, right? Where I understand the Baylor concerns, but I am not going to pick Baylor to lose before the Sweet 16. I'm just not going to do it. I'll let the public go with it. And if it happens, great. I don't think any of those teams that they play in the second round have, deep run potential.
It's funny you say that because, when running some of my numbers and some of my stuff, I actually think UCLA is one of my favorite leverage plays. Now, I don't think they can get there to the championship and win it, but I can definitely see them make a good Elite Eight run, maybe get to the Final Four if you're doing multiple brackets. So that was one of mine. And for the chaos, can we please have Colgate advance to the Final Four so it ruins everyone's DraftKings bracket?
Right.
Because you can't pick them in the DraftKings bracket due to the regulations.
And to that point, I like UCLA. I mean, if Juzang's healthy, look, like they're 15th offense, 12th defense. It seems like they're really starting to get into their stride. You look at St. Mary's on the 5 line there. That's a team they've like experienced, strap you on defense. Like their ball movement, motion offense is phenomenal. Like very efficient. Have that like leader, senior point guard. And Tommy Kuzi, that's another team that can give, and we're talking Sweet 16 at that point. And then you got at the bottom of the bracket, Kentucky and Purdue, who, I mean, that is a tough region when you compare it to what Kansas and Auburn have to deal with, in my eyes.
For sure, and I'll just add on to that really quickly before we move to the next segment. If Johnny Juzang shoots 90% from the mid range again, they're going to be a tough out.
Yeah. I mean, it's a team that like their offensive identity, like literally. I mean, if you look at it, they are 146 in effective field goal percentage and
So
189th in 2-point percentage. So literally, like that. You know what I mean? That's they're off, but they don't turn the ball over. They crash the boards, and they have multiple guys that can just take it to the bucket. One-on-one.
Speaking of those numbers you just spit off, Lead, are there any other teams where the analytics or the numbers just don't necessarily line up with your thinking or the full picture?
Yeah, and I hate to say this. I think it's pretty wide known, but Houston, they're 4th in KenPom right now. They lost their best player earlier in the year in Marcus Sasser. Trayvon Mark, a big rotational play. I mean, you could argue like they lost 2 of their best 5, maybe 4. Let's say 2 of their best 5 players, right?
Mm-hmm.
that's just hard to overcome for the same reason, we're kind of even feeling that way about Baylor, who Baylor has more, I think, players that can score, but Houston's also gotten away with not like since Sasser went down, because earlier in the year they lost a close game to Alabama, they lost a close game to Wisconsin, but then once the American Athletic Conference play started, like their toughest opponent was Memphis,
Yeah.
and they went 1-2 against Memphis. So in some ways, the analytics just don't reflect, I think, the true upside of this team. But on another end, there's something to be said for Kelvin Sampson. Their identity is they will literally scrap you. They will crash the boards. They play very slow. It's like everyone's bought in. You know what I mean? So it's not a
Yeah.
team that's missing an identity. So in some ways, it's like you may lose some upside with that, given who they've lost, but it feels like maybe there's more of a floor than people are giving.
For sure. And you figure like Sasser's a scorer. And if you look at their run last year, it was predicated on that defense hitting some timely shots. And when they couldn't get going on offense, it was Sasser who they were looking to. So without him, that in those tough games that you have to win in the tournament where you need to hit some shots, that's where they could fall.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, Lee. I think that just their style of
That
play
team
leads to
last year,
them. Yeah.
it's crazy because last year their team once again was like top 5 in Ken Palm, but they between Sasser and Quentin Grimes, like they had the scorers that you think
Yeah.
could really hurt you. They ran cold once they saw Baylor, but anyway, yeah, that's just a team. And yeah, Wisconsin, Providence, and I feel like anyone that like follows college hoops closely, this isn't a surprise. Like people have been poking holes on these teams all year. But I think it's pretty evident, and what it's worth, it's just I'm not going to be backing those 3 teams.
Makes sense to me. Brian, I'll kick it back this one over to you because I know you said that you're the numbers guy, the game theory expert. Overall, what's your best leverage plays you have for the big brackets that you're looking at?
For sure. So I'll go round by round and just give a couple picks of where the numbers don't line up with what the public is doing currently as of Tuesday. And again, once we get to this point, the numbers may tweak a little bit by a couple percentage points, but for the most part, the ideas are still there. So if you're looking at the early round, and if you're looking at where the public is going versus what you should be doing, San Francisco, the Wyoming winner, Marquette, San Diego State, all look like great picks. If you go to the round of 32, and this is what I'll do, I'll go round by round, and then Lead, I'll let you chime in on anything you have or any other
Let's
ideas.
let's start with San Fran. Before we move on, I think this is just a funny observation because when we looked at the leverage plays, like this one just really stood out. Round 1, right? San Francisco versus Murray State, where I think 70% of the picks were coming in at Murray State, and Murray State's a 1-point favorite, right? So it's like part of me feels like it's a little like, well, number one, that 2 losses near their record looks really good, I think, to people, right?
Sure.
But number 2, Ja Morant. People were like, oh, I remember Murray State, Ja Morant 2 years ago. They crushed in the tournament, right? Like they crushed Marquette. So, but it's funny to even see some of the human behaviors that are leading to like these gaps.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest key is looking at, because you figure what is available when someone is filling out a bracket. It is their seed. It is the historical knowledge that 12s beat 5s pretty often. It is the record that is shown. And it's any preconceived notion of what this program is like. And Murray State checks all those boxes, and that's why they're one of the most popular first-round picks. If you go to the second round, teams to advance to the Sweet 16, LSU, who we talked about already over Wisconsin, I don't know if they'll be a favorite, but it will be close, and they're a great leverage to make the Sweet 16 as a 6 seed. We talked about Houston already. They're going to be in there as well. And then after that, it gets really tough because it becomes low probability scenarios. And as we talked about, those aren't the spots where you need to get cute here. So really for me, Lead, it's just, and moves, it's just LSU and Houston as the teams that are going to be the higher seeds, but probably favorite to win.
Yeah, and I mean the LSU, even if you pick Iowa State, I think whoever it is, it's gonna like I don't see Wisconsin being more than like like if they play Iowa State, it might be like Wisconsin -5, right? They play LSU, it might be Wisconsin minus like 2.5. I think, and Will Wade did resign, or she got fired, whatever. It's been too long ongoing that right before the tournament, and that's like a piece of information that I think may have like resonated with a lot of people too, right? It's like, oh, the team's coach is no longer there. I'm going to lean towards Wisconsin, but and then regarding Houston, like you said, UAB kind of the darling there. They're going to be probably a little more popular, but versus Illinois, that's a game where people are now. I like Illinois' upside in this tournament. That's going to be a team where I'm going to have some brackets where I have them going far. I think they're just a complete team. They're very inconsistent. They could lose to Chattanooga first round, wouldn't surprise me. They could beat Arizona on their way to the Final Four. That wouldn't surprise me. But no, I think those two leverage points, I can understand the thinking behind it, right? Houston and LSU.
And a couple other teams, if we move on to like the Sweet 16, and Moose, I'm curious to get your thoughts here because if you look at just pure leverage, Texas Tech stands out, UCLA stands out, and they're in regions where they have somewhat popular, or in Texas Tech standpoint, they have Gonzaga. And I think it makes sense to where if you see this type of leverage, sure, it's risky in the Sweet 16, but if your bracket is picking someone from the other side to be the champion, it makes sense that their path is easier if the top seed is knocked out in one of the other regions. So it really comes down to, Moose, the bracket that you're building and the story you're telling, because then you're more likely to pick upsets in a region where you have someone from the opposite side of the bracket winning the championship. So that's where teams like UCLA and Texas Tech, LSU or Houston even look good if you're picking the bracket the right way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like literally anything else we've been telling you, from whether it's DFS, betting, or even in this case, picking bracket winners. If
Yeah.
you can look at your bracket from a high level and tell the story that it happens, then and it makes sense to you, then yeah, definitely go with it.
And to kind of piggyback off that, because it really highlights how I try to think of brackets. So, for instance, Gonzaga, right? Like they are by far the biggest favorite, right? Of this bracket. But then I look at a potential Sweet 16 matchup. I should say, yeah, Sweet 16 matchup with now, once again, both of these teams could lose in the first round, but UConn or Arkansas. And I think that's a relatively tough draw. Arkansas, like they can play up and down with Gonzaga. Jalen Williams, like big man, he'll have a paint presence. On top of just like their tenacity on defense. UConn, they almost play the opposite of Gonzaga. Like they want to slow you down. They do lockdown on D. Everyone crashes the boards, whereas Gonzaga wants to get out and transition. So that just kind of adds some variance, you know what I mean, to that sort of game. If like they're getting rebounds, if they're getting inside looks, Chet Holmgren gets in foul trouble. All to say is those are all things you would be even considering when you're looking at the Texas Tech and Duke side of it. Like if you
Yes.
like those teams, or all to say is like, let's say that scenario you're convincing yourself of, hey, I could see Gonzaga maybe run into trouble in the Sweet 16. Well, you don't necessarily have to even pick that as much as you do like, so if Gonzaga loses, who's coming out of that region, right?
Yeah.
So in general, those are the types of questions that I like to ask myself. And it just connects everything because even though one team's on the top of the bracket, the other team's in the bottom, they're not far away from, being connected.
Definitely. Brian, you have any more leverage plays or?
Those are the biggest ones, I think. If you get down to, let's say, I guess the Elite Eight and the Final Four, it's really those teams that we've hit on, right? It's Auburn, UCLA, Houston, if you believe in the identity, Iowa, Texas Tech, LSU. Those are the teams that stick out to me. But again, these are for brackets that are bigger. These are for brackets where you have chalkier outcomes in other circumstances or other regions. And again, as we'll transition here in a second, it depends on the bracket and the rules that you're playing if you're going to actually pick these teams to do what they expect.
Yeah, so let's talk about some bracket strategies. Lita, I actually wanted to piggyback to one of the things you said earlier in the show was, if you're with a bunch of Duke alums and they're probably every one of them is going to pick Duke for the winner.
They might just pick against them at this point.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So at what point do you just say, like, if Duke wins, I'm probably going to lose anyway. So do you either match the field on something like that? Because I imagine most people are probably playing with their buddies or their friends, or do you just do you fade that and have them go out Sweet 16, Elite 8,
I
do it
wouldn't.
different from there?
And just to kind of go into that, I wouldn't overestimate just how much you know about what other people like are picking. For instance, I'm in a Maryland, like kind of a alum pool that has grown for some time. And I mean, they're not in the tournament, right? But in past years, for instance, it's like, oh, okay, like it's probably going to be a little more backing of Maryland than others. I think most people probably emotionally aren't going to overdo that unless like their team is literally in the cream of the crop.
Okay.
But that said, I'm not really in like in a smaller bracket. I wouldn't overthink that. How I would look at it is in a smaller bracket, you need to be less different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you can be more chalky. So if you're in a pool of 10 people, like you don't need to have a 4 seed in your final four. Honestly, sounds great. You could have all four ones and twos, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and then pick a chalky champion, and then maybe pick one or two teams to go to the Sweet 16. That'll probably be the most optimal play in a bracket like that. But the larger the pool, then you do have to start factoring in and getting more granular. You're like, I have to get more right. I can't just get the big things right. You're gonna have to get the big things right, and then also a lot of the little things right too.
Yeah, because if you look at, I think a great way to do this, and it's really simple math, is if you pull up the ESPN public ownership percentages, you take the Final Four pick rates for the teams that you're picking in the Final Four, multiply them together, multiply by the number of people in your pool, and if it's a 10-person pool, that number is always going to be less than one, and you're going to be fine. Really, that starts to tell you how many quote unquote dupes you have, duplicate entries,
Four, yeah.
right? That require the earlier rounds to be more accurate for you to win the tournament. And that can determine how crazy you need to be in the Final Four or what types of picks you need to happen in the early round for you to win the tournament.
I'm gonna like and that's so important. Like repeat that and really break it down for people again, because I think that is the best way to at least contextualize, okay, how many duplicates of this Final Four are there going to be, right? You multiply, so you go on the ESPN percentage, and we'll do something as an example, right? So as far as teams in the Final Four, so that'd be so getting to the Final Four, right? You have let's take Baylor.
Let's take all the
I'm just
ones. If
throwing.
you take all the ones, I have actually have the math right here. If you take all the ones,
Okay.
right? So Gonzaga, roughly 60%, Kansas, roughly 40%, Baylor, roughly
Arizona,
30%, Arizona, roughly 40%, right? You
40%.
multiply all those together, and then you multiply that times the number of people in your bracket. If you multiply those numbers
Entries.
together, you get 3%. Right? So roughly 3% of the pools in whatever bracket you're playing are going to have those Final Four. Probably a little higher because they are one seeds and just based on how
They are
people
one
pick,
seeds.
right?
Yeah.
But if you're playing it with a 100-person bracket, roughly 3 to 6 people are going to have all 4 one seeds.
So
That's
think about that for a second. Just literally think about that.
right. Only 3% are going to have the highest probability. Maybe 6% if we do that are going to have the highest probability. Now we're in a 1,000-person bracket, and 30 people are doing it. Now it gets a little trickier. You're in a 10,000-person bracket like the DraftKings one. Now 300 people are doing it. Now it requires you to be much more accurate in the early rounds. Whereas if you just make one different point lead, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's vital information, and that's like the best nugget you can apply. And I just don't think people, in fact, I think people most of the time psych themselves out in smaller pools, right? They're so focused on, I want to predict the best possible and most accurate bracket instead of thinking, I want to beat my competition, right? And that's
Moose,
the two different.
right. It's two different things. Moose, we talk about it all the time in DFS. Your goal isn't to score the most points. Your goal is to maximize your win probability.
Exactly. Yep. You pretty much hit that on the head. Yep. So, Lead, anything else you want to add about different bracket strategies or different types of scoring systems, stuff like that?
Have fun, honestly. I know it sounds silly, but I think that you can drive yourself insane when you overthink things and you're
Mhm.
like, oh, well, I should change this, that, and the other. Focus on the big things, right? Like really identify who are your national championship contenders, right? Like, and you should know by now, like, what do you look for in those things? You look for you need an incredible offense. You need to be able to play good defense. You need to have length. You need to be able to guard guys 1 through 5. You need to have NBA talent. Like you're not just going to win with like 4-year seniors, but you also need guys with experience, right? So like make your national championship pool. It could be narrow. It could be 2 teams. You could say, you know what, I'm just banking on these 2 teams. It could be 5, 6, anything beyond that. Like if you're going like, if you start throwing in like, 4 seeds, it's like, all right, relax. Like, there's no need for that. And then work your way back. Then think of, all right, what are the possible Final Four teams, right? What would need to break? What would be the benefit of me, for instance, nailing a team like UCLA, which you like? I like UCLA. I like St. Mary's, right? I like Kentucky. I like all those teams relative to maybe the ownership. But then you just got to factor in what else needs to kind of break your way. So all to say is like, have fun. Don't really complicate it either. Like, you'll find like the best brackets aren't necessarily the ones that you maybe spent like hours working on. Do the research, really get to know these teams, understand the odds, understand the bigger picture, kind of the game theory, everything we've discussed, the percentages, like quote unquote ownership of, or percentages of people with similar Final Fours, and then just make the brackets. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't need to like waffle over this 7-10 matchup. Like, who cares? It's not going to make a difference at the end of the day.
Definitely. And so I have 2 final questions. I'll ask each of you for this. The DraftKings pool is 20 entry max. So if you're 20 maxing the DraftKings pool, how many different national champions would you have? I'll start with you, Lead.
I'm still kind of trying to figure that out myself. So my apologies for not being red hot ready with it. I had a crazy thought last night. I was like, maybe what if I just faded Gonzaga completely and went like it really put the emphasis on like 4 or 5 other teams. And I talked myself out of that pretty quick. But just based off like the pure projections, there's a strategy that you could say that could make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if 30% of the pool is picking this, like you're still gonna, if you get your champion right, you're still gonna have to beat 3,000 people. But I would say right now my pool of champions is probably 6 teams.
Okay.
And give or take maybe another team here or there. But as far as national champions, I think it'll be concentrated probably heavily on 3 teams with maybe teams 4 and 5 sprinkled in.
Okay. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I would probably limit it to 4 or 5. I would try to get 4 if I could. If we just look last year, when I played the DraftKings bracket, I had 20 entries, and the lowest seed I had winning it all was Michigan, I think, and they were a 2 seed, or maybe Houston, and they were a 2 seed. And
Yeah.
if you just, I didn't have really any crazy Final Fours, but having a 2 seed or a 1 seed win it, all 20 of my brackets had unique Final Four plus finals plus champions. Just goes to show that, all it takes is one little different, or even a lesser known champion for you to get you different in your bracket.
Ooh. And then I'm going to assume, Brian, this video is going to be published tonight.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
So, all right. So we won't do the 640 game. So I want each of you all, the Indiana, Wyoming, currently Indiana minus 4.5, 132. What's the best bet for that game? Start off with you, Walid.
Probably the under. I don't even know what is the implied total for that game.
It's right now. It looks like it's 132.5.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 teams that don't necessarily play fast. But
Just take Wyoming money line. That's the bet. Just take Wyoming money line.
There we go.
No, I think. Yeah, see, this is why I don't bet, because I waffle a lot when it comes to these things. I'll say Indiana money line.
Okay, so we got Indiana money line and Wyoming money line. So either way, someone's going to win. There we go.
What's that? What's that, Moose? Minus 180 or minus 200?
Yeah, minus 200.
Okay, yeah. See, I wouldn't lay that bet. That's not a fun bet.
Cool.
But
Brian,
hey, the dance is back. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to see these 2 teams in action, and one of them will be playing on Thursday.
Definitely. Yep. So, Brian, do you want to take us out of here?
Sure. Also bet Texas Southern in the playing game. They're monsters from what the numbers are telling me, the hashtag numbers. So I appreciate everyone listening. As always, we love doing these shows. If you guys have questions about bracket strategy, we're going to be in the Discord all the way through the weekend. So, or if you have questions about bets, hit us up, occupyfantasy.com/Discord. If you're watching this on YouTube, just click the join button below the video. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Brian Jester FF. Moose is at CFP_Moose. Lead is at PC_Lead. We appreciate it. Good luck, everyone, in your brackets. Remember, if you're on a legal sports betting state, we have partnerships with legal sportsbooks for deposit bonuses. Click the betting tab on OccupyFantasy.com to make sure you get those bonuses because there will be a lot, I guarantee, of promos and bonuses for March Madness. So make sure you take advantage of those. So for Moose, for Walid, for Brian, that's me. From Occupy Fantasy, appreciate you listening and good luck in March Madness.